This is BBC One in the Midlands. Now the news at 10 o'clock with Peter Sissons and Suzanne Virdee.
Gordon Brown says Britain won't be knocked off course by the terrorist onslaught. There'll be no cuts in public spending despite testing times ahead. Scratching for food on the Taliban's borders as hunger tightens its grip. Killed after months of maltreatment, how the system failed little Lauren. The pupil who's suing her school for thousands because she did badly in an A-level.
And here in the Midlands tonight, uniformed police patrol the school hit by crime and why are paedophiles back behind bars after allowing a teenage boy into his home.
Good evening. Gordon Brown assessed the economic damage today, less than 3 weeks after terrorists sent shockwaves around the world. The Chancellor told Labour's conference that Britain faced testing and uncertain times, but said the country could come through without sacrificing cherished spending plans. Mr Brown also confirmed that millions of pounds linked to terrorists had been frozen in Britain. The German Chancellor, a guest in Brighton, paid tribute to the way the coalition against the terrorists' faceless barbarism was taking shape.
Shoulder to shoulder with yet another world leader, Tony Blair's acknowledged now in his role as coalition builder. Today in Brighton, he played host to Gerhard Schröder. But Britain's role in the coming conflict will far outweigh that of partners like Germany. The Prime Minister was cautiously confident the bills could be met.
We've got a very strong situation on public finances. We've got perhaps the lowest interest rates for 30, 40 years here. And we're very confident that the public finances are in proper shape to do the things that we need to do.
I would ask you to welcome Gordon Brown.
In the conference hall, it was the Chancellor's job to explain how Britain could afford what could be a long and expensive commitment. There was no doubt about why.
It has now fallen to our generation to bear the burden of defeating international terrorism.
So the financial squeeze was on. £60 million frozen in bank accounts linked to the Taliban. He acknowledged fears of an economic slowdown, but the promise to spend more on services held good. Big spending ministers would have to count every penny.
Testing times will demand more discipline, not less. So when we're told that it's time to abandon our spending limits, to relax our discipline, to set aside our fiscal rules, to break our manifesto promises on tax, I say to you, we shall not relapse back into the irresponsible quick fixes of the past.
The speech went down well, but many noted the Chancellor's promise to hold down income tax didn't rule out other taxes going up in future. It was another show of solidarity. There are gripes against the government, though. Around the conference centre, green lanyards issued by one union carry slogans in defence of public services. In the hall, hostility to giving the private sector a bigger role was plain.
Britain will be better off if we got rid of the failed contractors and showed a lot more faith in our public service workers.
Applause from the rank and file, silence from the hierarchy. But in the end, the conference declared its opposition to privatising public services, and everyone could agree with that. In the current climate, on the eve of Tony Blair's big speech, the Labour Party's feeling its obligation to put on a show of unity. John Pienaar, BBC News, Brighton.
The Chancellor's speech came as figures were released that sent mixed signals on the state of the economy. The Nationwide, Britain's biggest building society, said the housing market was still buoyant, but showing signs of slowing, while manufacturing is continuing to shrink. So is Gordon Brown right to be so optimistic about his spending plans? Our economics correspondent Jenny Scott reports.
The Hyatt Regency in Birmingham hasn't been quite as packed as it should have been lately. The cancellation of the Ryder Cup golf at the nearby Belfry has cost the hotel £500,000 in lost bookings. Just one setback in what are very uncertain times.
We're not really sure of how things are going to work out. International business certainly seems to be down, but the UK market still seems to be active as normal, although we're a little bit cautious about what's going to happen over the next few months.
And it's not just hotels that have suffered in the aftermath of the attacks in the US. Today, baggage handlers heard that 700 jobs in the industry are to go. Rising unemployment could cause real problems for the public finances.
We are likely to see slower growth, and that means lower tax revenue and also higher public spending on things like social security payments to the unemployed. So I think we will see higher borrowing, but I don't think that means that the Chancellor should feel the need to raise taxes.
But even if Gordon Brown does borrow more, he could still meet his self-imposed spending rules. So what exactly are these famous fiscal rules? The first is that the government's budget must balance over the economic cycle. In other words, it can slip into debt in lean times to pay for things like nurses and teachers, as long as it pays that back when things pick up. Secondly, the government mustn't borrow more than 40% of the size of the total economy. It currently owes around 30%. The Chancellor inherited a £28 billion deficit. But using those rules, he's turned that into a £20 billion surplus. But that's expected to fall back into deficit soon, and given the current pressures, it could be worse than the government hopes.
He left one big question unanswered today. If the economic slowdown continues, gets worse, if that means a reduction in tax revenues and an increase in social costs, to carry on investing in those public services, where's it going to come from?
The housing market remains one robust source of revenue. There were strong price rises again in September. But given the current climate, even that isn't expected to last. Jenny Scott, BBC News.
And our political editor, Andrew Marr, is at the Labour conference in Brighton now. Andrew, first, has Tony Blair got the total backing of this conference for his role and his policy in the fight against terrorism? And if he hasn't, how much trouble is in store?
Well, no Labour leader ever has the total backing of the Labour Party for anything. He's got pretty overwhelming backing, but there's a lot of worries in this party, particularly about issues like the civil liberties questions. Now, the Labour Party has never actually been a great civil liberties party, that's the Liberals, but they do care about these things. And on issues like ID cards, there is some trouble ahead. It's very interesting today. The government are beginning to back away from the ID cards issue. They're beginning to ask questions about whether our own dear Home Office, who brought us the passports crisis and all the rest of it, could actually combat terrorism with an enormously expensive ID card scheme. So government ministers have got to tread pretty carefully over those sorts of issues.
Now, how's he going to play his big speech tomorrow? A stage-managed coronation after his second big landslide, or something more sombre?
Well, no, not a coronation. An informed guess, it's going to be pretty dramatic stuff. At its core is going to be a very brutal, blunt message to the Taliban, which is basically, you've made your choice. You had a choice about siding with your terrorist house guests or handing them over, and it's perfectly clear which you've chosen. And therefore, what follows from that is that you are now a target. And I think that's one of the messages. The Taliban are now a military target. You know, if you were a Taliban official polishing a nose cone of one of those rusting MiGs outside Kabul airport, I think then tomorrow you would be pretty fast about getting some sick leave and getting out of there. On the other hand, Tony Blair is not talking about timing. He's not saying this is going to happen tomorrow. He's not going to say it's going to happen at the weekend or next week. He is, however, saying very bluntly it is going to happen.
Andrew Marr, thank you. The national airline of Switzerland, Swissair, is breaking up after finding it impossible to bear the loss of business that followed the terrorist attacks. Thousands of jobs will be lost. Swissair will hand over most of its flights to a subsidiary airline, Crossair, and seek protection from bankruptcy for other parts of its business. President Bush says the United States has made progress in its campaign against terrorism. He said millions of dollars held in bank accounts linked to terrorist activity had been frozen as part of the drive to cut off funding to those behind the attacks. Earlier, the mayor of New York, Rudolph Giuliani, addressed the United Nations as it gathered to debate new global measures against the terrorists. But Americans remain nervous of future attacks, as Stephen Sacco reports.
Slowly, painstakingly, the bodies are being removed. Underneath the mountain of rubble, thousands more remain. The grim recovery effort, a daily test of endurance for all those involved.
Stay back. Right
Today,
here.
100 congressmen visited New York's Ground Zero to see for themselves the enormity of the horror inflicted on America.
A
couple of miles away at the United Nations, New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani asked the whole world to take a stand against the terrorists.
On this issue, terrorism, the United Nations must draw a line. The era of moral relativism must end. We're right and they're wrong. It's as simple as that.
But as President Bush acknowledges, there is nothing simple about waging war on terror. He continues to juggle diplomatic, legal, and military options.
I'm proud to report that we're making progress on many fronts. We're finding out members of the Al-Qaeda organization, who they are, where they think they can hide, and we're slowly but surely bringing them to justice.
Americans, though, remain apprehensive. This Washington store, like many across the nation, has sold out of gas masks. These masks probably wouldn't help much if a chemical or biological attack were ever to happen, but days of speculation about future threats have had an effect.
The gas masks disappear so fast. Got people coming in buying 12 at a time, 10 at a time. We can't keep them in the store.
Last week, the president told America to get back to normal, but the signals coming out of Washington are confusing. The city's airport, for example, is still closed. Some officials believe its proximity to the center of government makes it an unacceptable risk. So the airport is the subject of a battle between those in government who want to get back to business and security advisors who remain focused on the terrorist threat. And for now, it is the threat which is uppermost in many people's minds. Stephen Sacker, BBC News, Washington.
Pakistan's President General Musharraf has said the Taliban's days could be numbered. He told the BBC that the Taliban were unlikely to surrender Osama bin Laden despite Pakistan's intervention, and that conflict with the United States seemed inevitable. Well, our World Affairs editor John Simpson is in the Pakistani capital, Islamabad, now. John, when Musharraf says the Taliban's days could be numbered, is this a turning point for Pakistan, or is he just stating the obvious?
Well, I think it's both, really. He's a military man, you must remember. He's a pretty blunt-spoken character. He doesn't have those political skills which enable people to argue that black is white and white is black. And when the BBC interviewer pushed him and said, in effect, isn't your policy, Pakistan's policy towards the Taliban, completely in ruins now? And aren't the Taliban's days numbered? He couldn't really do very much more than simply agree. After all, Pakistan has been irrevocably tied to the Taliban. They nurtured it in the early stages. They've turned Taliban-controlled Afghanistan virtually into a kind of colony of Pakistan in economic terms. When I was there just a week ago, briefly, I saw literally dozens of lorries still churning their way into Afghanistan from Pakistan filled with goods. So really that's all going to come to an end now, and Pakistan is left without any kind of policy once the Taliban go, and with a certain amount of resentment from all those Afghans who hate the Taliban.
John, just tell us what you make of another development today. Jordan's King Abdullah is quoted as saying George Bush has promised him that there'll be no United States attacks on any Arab country. How do you read that?
Well, from this perspective, Peter, it really looks as though the kind of moderate voices in Washington and elsewhere too are winning this war inside Washington for the heart, as it were, of American policy towards the whole of this question of terrorism. That must be, I think, a victory for Colin Powell, the Secretary of State, victory for people like King Abdullah himself, and also for people like Tony Blair, who are saying, let's have a proportionate kind of response to this. And it makes life an awful lot easier, or it will do, to those countries which side with America in this region.
John Simpson, thank you. And later in this news, a special report from Tajikistan, one of Afghanistan's neighbours, which is also facing a humanitarian disaster. But now, the rest of the day's news. The father and stepmother of 6-year-old Lauren Wright were today both found guilty of her manslaughter. Tracy Wright abused and tormented her stepdaughter for more than a year, whilst Craig Wright turned a blind eye to his wife's cruelty. When she died in May last year, Lauren's body was covered in more than 60 bruises. An inquiry into the handling of the case by social workers, teachers and doctors says many opportunities to protect her were missed.
Morning, Tracy.
Tracy Wright subjected her 6-year-old stepdaughter to a hellish life of abuse, beating her, even force-feeding her sandwiches filled with pepper. The court was told she treated the child worse than a dog. Lauren died after 2 punches to the stomach so hard her digestive system collapsed. She had more than 60 bruises and the once chubby-faced child was emaciated. Lauren's father, Craig, claimed he knew nothing of the abuse, but the police say he just turned a blind eye.
Know that there was an absolutely horrific campaign of cruelty, physical and mental abuse being waged on poor Lauren by Tracy, and he was in that household and he didn't do anything.
But Craig Wright's family left the court insisting he was innocent. His mother lived next door and she too believed Tracy's lies about Lauren.
When someone you love and trust tells you every reason why she has bruises on her, also she was very thin. We honestly, seriously thought she had something terribly wrong with her that no doctor had picked up.
But in the small Norfolk village of Welney where they lived, neighbours were increasingly worried.
I've got 3 different stories. The first one was that she was actually playing blindsman's buff and walked into the door. 2 days later, the next one was she actually fell over and fell into the washing machine. And about 2 days later after that, it was the dog jumped up and smacked her in the eye of its paw.
Witness after witness took the stand here at Norwich Crown Court to describe seeing Lauren hit, even punched in the head. Most said nothing. But if they did ask questions about the bruises, then Tracy Wright always had a ready explanation. And at a news conference, Norfolk Social Services admitted they too hadn't done enough to check out the stories when they were called in.
Had we followed those procedures already in place, Lauren would in all probability still be alive today. But we did not.
Lauren's death has left many people feeling they could have done more to protect her. Alison Holt, BBC News, Norfolk.
A Leeds couple want approval to use test tube baby techniques to help save the life of their 2-year-old son. The Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority is considering their request, but opponents say it's morally wrong to create babies for spare parts. Raz and Shahana Hashmi want doctors to select an embryo with the correct tissue match for their son Zain, who has a rare blood disorder. The baby could then act as a donor for him. The Liberal Democrat MP Norman Baker has successfully challenged the ban on individuals seeing files held on them by the security services. An appeals tribunal ruled today that national security couldn't be used as a reason to block every request. Prince Edward left for Buckingham Palace tonight after his television company agreed to hand over a film it took at St Andrews University, where Prince William is studying. Ardent Productions was accused of breaching a media agreement aimed at protecting Prince William's privacy. A student who claims she underperformed in her Latin A-level because of poor teaching is suing her private school in Sussex. Kate Clark had been predicted to get the top grade in Latin, but was awarded the lowest because she claimed she was taught by an inexperienced teacher. She says her future career prospects could be affected and wants compensation.
Instead of the A grade she expected, Kate Norfolk ended up with an E in A-level Latin. She fears that'll affect her plans to become a top lawyer.
If I want to go to do law afterwards, a conversion course or bar school, it's still relatively recent, so they can still look at my A-levels. Whether I get a good degree or not, it's still going to affect me.
So, despite some happy school days, Kate's family thinks she's owed compensation.
If she's got some money that will enable her to buy a flat or a house, that will in some way recompense her for the misery of not having the exams that she expected and worked to get.
Her school, Hurstpierpoint, fees £10,000 plus, disagrees. It admits a lapse by a young teacher who's now left the profession, but says it did persuade her first-choice university, Exeter, to accept her, so she won't lose out.
Although there might be an aspect whereby she didn't do as well as she might have hoped in that one A-level subject, it will not have a huge bearing upon the overall progress of her future.
Head teachers worry the trend to sue for breach of contract could spread to state schools.
This is the first example that we have in an independent school of the parents turning to the law about the quality of teaching and the examination results. But it's something that could happen in state schools just as easily.
Parents have successfully sued when special educational needs like dyslexia haven't been met. But lawyers say it's another thing putting a price on failing an exam. Headmasters here are concerned that cases like this could have a negative effect on schools. At a time of teacher shortages, they say, it could lead to them targeting their best teachers only at the examination years. And that would be unfair on other pupils. Mike Baker, BBC News, at the Headmasters' Conference in London.
The daughter of the former American President Bill Clinton began life as a student at University College, Oxford today, following in the footsteps of her father. Chelsea Clinton is taking a 2-year course in international relations and says she doesn't want to be treated differently to any other student. It's the same college at which her father was a Rhodes Scholar in the late 60s. Now football and Premier League. Leicester City are looking to find a new manager by next Saturday after sacking Peter Taylor. Taylor, a former England caretaker coach, lost his job at Leicester after a series of bad results. But today he said that replacing him was a mistake.
It's the business of football which counts most these days, and with a new stadium to pay for, Leicester City plc can't afford to keep losing. A year ago, Peter Taylor's team was top of the Premier League, but defeat at the hands of Charlton on Saturday left them rock bottom. The cost of relegation more than the Leicester chairman dare contemplate.
This club requires Premiership football. Our fans require Premiership football. The new stadium needs Premiership football. And the truth was that we couldn't take the risk.
Only last October, Taylor was being entrusted with the full England squad as the FA awaited the arrival of Sven-Göran Eriksson. It was his decision to make David Beckham captain. But at club level, his team have won just one of the last 19 competitive matches, even losing to Wycombe Wanderers in last season's FA Cup. His departure had become inevitable.
I understand people have to make decisions for the club's interest, and I don't agree with that decision. I think that I'm the man to sort this club out, and but they've made that decision, and I will just accept it.
Peter Taylor's clearly aggrieved at his dismissal despite the results, but more than ever in football, time equals money, and Leicester City could feel both slipping away. David Eads, BBC News at Filbert Street.
Now, more on the deepening humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan and its neighbours as refugees continue to live in fear of war. Many thousands of Afghans are heading for the border with Tajikistan, but the former Soviet Republic is refusing to let them in because it's struggling to cope with a crisis of its own. Widespread hunger caused by a drought. For the second year running, the country's harvest has failed, and now more than 1 million people in Tajikistan face famine. Many have already sold their possessions to pay for food and now have nothing left. In a special report from Tajikistan, David Shukman reports.
Imagine how hungry you'd have to be to steal food from a rat. That's what these boys are doing, breaking through the baked soil to look for grain that rats have hidden underground. We're so short of food, says Fazuddin. What else can we do? Threatened by conflict, Central Asia is now stricken by drought. There are what are called negative harvests, which mean that from this barren soil you get back less than you put in. In villages like Olim Toy, the impact is catastrophic. The children are hungry and listless. They get 1 meal a day, and they're barefoot, so they can't go to school. This house used to have a roof made of metal, no longer. Like thousands of others, the owner, Karim Shapirov, has actually sold his roof to pay for food for his family. It's a measure of how desperate Tajikistan has become. When you sold the roof, how much food did that buy you? How long did it keep going?
For 1.5 months.
So the food lasted 1.5 months. So this is life on the edge of survival. 80% of the country lives below the poverty line, vulnerable to disease, fearful of war, and overrun by the endless dust. For the second year running, Tajikistan is desperately short of rain and it's fast becoming a dust bowl. But drought isn't the only problem. This country used to be part of a superpower. Now it's one of the world's poorest. It's not quite Africa, but it's getting there. Tajikistan is collapsing, but with Afghanistan as a neighbour, the outside world keeps its distance. So people are suffering alone. You know things are serious when children in their hundreds look like this. This is a special feeding centre run by the charity Action Against Hunger. The authorities don't admit there's a problem and tried to stop us filming. But malnutrition affects nearly half of all children in Tajikistan. And now to add to the vicious circle of hunger, drought and poverty, there's the new danger of getting caught up in someone else's war. David Shukman, BBC News in Tajikistan.
It's 26 minutes past 10. There's continuing coverage of the events in Afghanistan and the global campaign against terrorism on BBC News 24. I'll be back a little later with an update on the day's headlines, but now we join our news teams across the United Kingdom.
Good evening, I'm Suzanne Virdee. The Home Office has confirmed that a teenager has been found hanged at his cell at Brinsford Young Offenders Institution near Wolverhampton, the second suicide there in 12 months. 19-year-old Cortezo Malone had been awaiting sentencing after being convicted for robbery and assault. He was found late on Friday, but the Home Office has only tonight confirmed the incident, saying there would be an internal investigation by the prison service. Uniformed police have been patrolling the grounds of a school today to try to stem a growing crime wave. In the past weeks, a sawn-off shotgun has been found under a classroom and drug dealers have been operating in the area around the school. Over the last year, crime has cost the Education Authority £1 million. Colin Pemberton reports.
For the next 2 weeks, there'll be at least 2 police officers patrolling Wood Green High School in Wednesbury. At break times, lunch and at the end of the school day, they'll be watching and chatting to try to crack down on crime that has seen the school repeatedly burgled and damaged. Alongside the M6 at Junction 9 near Walsall, Wood Green has suffered 17 incidents since the start of this school term. 2 weeks ago, beneath a mobile classroom, a sawn-off shotgun was found wrapped in a black bin liner.
It's something that we have to do to make sure that the schools are protected, because when heads and teachers come into school of a morning, they're not knowing what they're going to find, whether the last day's work has been trashed or not, and whether the computers have been stolen.
Computer theft in particular is still rising in schools. Some are repeatedly broken into when they've re-equipped. It's known there's drug dealing outside Wood Green, and even the CCTV cameras there have been stoned. But teachers' unions say it's no worse than many other schools.
Society generally has a problem. Wood Green is part of society. It's dealing with a particular problem that it has at the moment. It is not exceptional.
Extra security systems in schools have cost Sandwell Council £1 million in the past year. At Wood Green, 50,000 will now be spent. But for now, it finds itself with police mingling with its pupils.
A convicted paedophile who allowed a 15-year-old boy to stay the night at his home has been sent back to prison. The judge told Martin Nightingale, who has a string of convictions for sexual offences, he was a dangerous man who urgently needed help. Amber Henshaw was at Wolverhampton Crown Court.
Martin Nightingale, who's 34, broke an order which banned him from having any contact with anyone under the age of 18. It was imposed after he was released from prison in April. He has a string of convictions for sexual offences dating back to 1988. In June, police took the unusual step of naming and releasing photographs of Nightingale. They had serious concerns that he was a risk to the public. The court heard that during a routine check by police at Nightingale's house, a 15-year-old boy was found to have spent the night on his sofa, in breach of the earlier order. Nightingale of Graiseley, Wolverhampton, admitted breaching the order, but Lee Masters, defending, said there was no suggestion that any offence had been committed. Judge Richard Randall, in sentencing Nightingale, told him that he had no doubt in his present condition that he was a danger to the public, and in particular to young children. He told him that he needed to get help while he was serving his 2-year sentence.
A former Birmingham council worker who was racially abused at work is to receive compensation of £116,000. It follows an industrial tribunal in which Anthony Tang, who's Chinese, was found to have been threatened and bullied. Today, the City Council's announced that it's reached agreement with Mr Tang to compensate him for the loss of income and personal injury, as well as a contribution to his legal costs. A 22-year-old man's been found dead in his flat in Newcastle-under-Lyme. The police are treating the death as suspicious. The victim, named as Gregory George Steele, was last seen at 9:30 yesterday evening after being dropped off at his home. 7 former Rover workers who lost their jobs when the company was broken up were today trying to prove they were promised a job for life under an agreement signed in 1992. Paul Bailey is among 9 workers who are claiming unfair dismissal after the compulsory redundancies. Every ambulance service in the Midlands has joined forces to call for urgent action over the number of violent attacks on staff. It follows an incident which left a paramedic blinded in one eye. Liz Copper reports.
These are some of the weapons used to attack ambulance staff. Attacks on paramedics are increasingly frequent and increasingly violent.
Millennium Eve, we went to assist somebody in their house. Gentleman turned violent, kicked me and my colleague in the head.
He come very violent towards me, even though police presence was there, and subsequently kicked me in the chest, knocking me backwards in the ambulance, and subsequently I'm off work at the moment, having suffered cracked ribs and a strained back injury.
It was outside the North Staff's accident unit. We were unloading a patient when the patient suddenly turned around and punched me in the face.
I actually then had to restrain the patient by sitting on him, so Mark didn't sustain any more injury.
Representatives of every ambulance service in the Midlands have called for more to be done to protect staff. It follows a crash in Derbyshire when a brick was thrown through an ambulance windscreen. The driver, Nick Horrobin from Uttoxeter, lost the sight in one of his eyes. He's still in intensive care.
With the type of culture changing within this country of guns, etc., I think someday someone will walk in on the wrong situation and it could well lead to a fatality.
In some areas, the number of violent attacks has doubled in the last year. As crews try to save other people's lives, they're often in fear of their own lives.
That's the Midlands News tonight. Now back to Peter Sissons in London. Bye-bye for now.
And the main news again. Tony Blair is expected to tell the Labour conference tomorrow that military action in Afghanistan is now inevitable. Gordon Brown has promised the government will stand by its plans to increase public spending despite testing times ahead. And the stepmother and father of 6-year-old Lauren Wright have been found guilty of her manslaughter. Newsnight is starting now over on BBC Two, but from the 10 o'clock news, good night.
I feel sad. They are innocent people.
When a single event changes history, how does it look through the eyes of a child?
Don't create a war, it will go to mayhem.
On Wednesday, children from around the world share their feelings about the events of the last 3 weeks.
My children at 10 and at 13 are left without a father.
On Thursday, we hear the stories of the British who lost their loved ones and those who lived to tell the tale.
Somebody weren't as lucky as I was.
Terror in America, Wednesday and Thursday night on BBC One.
Good evening to you. We've just seen some typical wild autumnal weather, gusts up to 78 miles an hour and 1.5 inches or so of rain at Esdelmuir, and there's some more to come. Mind you, it wasn't the same everywhere. A little bit of shelter across in the east, and Scarborough enjoyed 9 hours of sunshine. Now, what we're looking for at the moment is a little area of low pressure that's developing down to the southwest of us. You can see the way this bump in the cloud here has got bigger and bigger as it's running towards us. That's the new little area of low pressure. It's going to zip across the southwestern parts of England and eventually move on out of the way into the continent. But in the process, it is going to bring some wet and possibly even windy weather to those southernmost parts of the country. Now, as we saw, we did have a lot of rain clearing away during the night. It was followed by a packet of showers, and some of those showers have been really heavy with hail and thunder too. You can begin to see the clouds thickening to the southwest. So those showers are going to continue around those western coasts for the rest of the night. Again, some quite heavy ones with thunder, and before the night's out towards morning, some very wet weather indeed coming into southern parts of both England and Wales as that area of low pressure comes up towards Brittany. A reasonable mild night though, just about everywhere. So that heavy rain is going to set in the morning, so if you're driving around during the morning in southern parts, do watch out. Persistent rain is going to give some local flooding. Could well be some gales along the Channel coast too, so a very wet start there. During the course of the day though, that wet weather will ease away to be replaced by brighter conditions, although in the brighter weather there will be some showers, and the rest of the country having a mixture of sunshine and showers like today. Some of those showers quite heavy with hail and thunder, and a pretty windy day as well. Temperatures held down in the showers and in the rain, but with a bit of shelter, perhaps not too bad. And the wind is the theme of the weather really for the next few days. We've seen a windy day, we're going to have some windy weather. Eases down for a while around late Wednesday into Thursday before a new area of low pressure comes along and picks those winds up to around gale force again. Into Wednesday, it's a case of sunshine and showers, even some longer outbreaks of rain working their way, I think, across southern parts of the country. But it will be windy, and again, some of those showers could be quite heavy. There'll be hail and thunder mixed in with them as well. Then, as we saw, we're going to have that quieter interlude on Thursday. Doesn't rule out the possibility of 1 or 2 showers, especially in the north, and it isn't going to last either, because later on in the day, in many western areas, it will cloud over and yet again turn wet and windy. On Friday, that rain will be spreading across and away from the east, followed again by a return of blustery showers, some of them heavy and quite windy with it. Good night.
As the England Roadshow arrives at Old Trafford, they know that destiny is in their own hands. A win means a place in the World Cup finals. Join Gary Lineker as England take on Greece in Match of the Day live, Saturday from 1, kick-off at 3, live on BBC One and Radio 5 Live.
Tracking down asylum seekers, it's a tough job. Strong language now on BBC One. Welcome to Britain.
Number 1, the Sri Lankan male, Terminal 3 failed asylum seeker. All his avenues of appeal exhausted only in January this year.